Good afternoon. I'm Hatem Kir, Counsel for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. So to begin, Ms. Chaillet, the national terrorist threat level has been at medium since October 2014, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and it didn't change during the protests?
You know, the threat level has 5 different levels, and they're fairly broad bands, and so the threat level fluctuates within the medium band, so it fluctuated during the convoy.
But it never left medium?
No.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Vigneault, the CSIS Act is the home statute of your organization, so is it fair to say that CSIS has expertise in applying the statute?
Yes, I would say that.
Okay, and so Section 12 requires that CSIS investigate wherever there are reasonable grounds to suspect there's a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so that just it doesn't require certainty, it doesn't require reasonable grounds to believe, it's just reasonable suspicion, right?
To initiate investigations, yes.
Yeah, okay. And that's an assessment that CSIS does day in and day out?
Yes.
Okay. Now, as someone whose father was monitored by your organization for over 10 years until it was determined an investigation wasn't actually necessary, my personal experience is that it seems that your organization is very thorough. Is that a fair assessment that CSIS is rigorous in executing its duties?
I'm not sure the context of your the premise of your question, but I would say that we try to be thorough in what we do, yes.
Right, because I mean, a big reason that your agency's members have to be thorough is that if CSIS incorrectly determines something is not a threat and then chooses not to investigate, that could lead to harms down the road, right?
I would say that investigating threats to the security of Canada is a very complex issue. Missing, signs, missing information, and having incorrect assessment is indeed something that we are very careful about. And as a learning organization, we try to make sure that we learn from the past and that we are trying to come with the best possible assessment on an ongoing basis.
Right. So you said something earlier, and I was just trying to write it down as you said it, but something to the effect that CSIS mobilized whatever resources it could in order to try and understand the Freedom Convoy protest. Is that right?
Something similar to that. Yeah, I would say it's accurate, yes.
Okay. So you've talked a bit about the potential for a lone wolf threat. Now, am I correct in thinking that that's not based off of particular intelligence? It's more of a conclusion from general principles about this kind of an event?
This is based on expert analysis by CSIS, by ITAC, and other organizations that to understand the dynamic environment in where violent rhetoric can push individuals to act. And unfortunately, we've seen a number of people who were not on the radar of anyone who were consuming this type of information and indeed, a committed act of terrorism or extreme violence. So we are, unfortunately, it is a very complex dynamic environment, and we have to be careful about people who would be very quickly move from just being a recipient and consumer of information to someone who would radicalize to violence. Okay,
so there was you were just asked questions about the potential that people were present at the protests that CSIS was already monitoring, but basically your organization was keeping tabs on them, right?
So, as we've said in our public testimony, we were aware of, we already had subject of investigations who we assessed were interested in the protest. We use different techniques to assure ourselves of their activities. And we also continue to look for other individuals that might be recruited or might be approached or might want to radicalize throughout the events in question, obviously respecting the mandate of CSIS.
Okay, now, but just to go back to the general point, the idea is that this is a large gathering. It could be used as an opportunity by someone to commit, to engage in some sort of a threat. But that kind of threat is present at other big events like a G7 protest, right?
Unfortunately, with the dynamic of what we see IMVE, the threat is persistent. This is why the national terrorism threat level is set at medium. That means that, today here in Canada, there are individuals with the capability and intention to engage in an act of terrorism. And so I would say, yes, those larger events, but also more broadly, it is a dynamic that exists throughout our society, irrespective of those large events as well.
And what I would add to that is, as I testified earlier today, part of the ideology in IMVE is anti-authority. So they exploit that type of feeling amongst people for their own, to try to recruit people to a more extremist ideology, their own more extreme ideology.
Okay, thank you.
I was also just going to add, if I may, very quickly, that one of the challenges of studying IMV-related threats is that what mobilizes someone to violence can be very, very personal. The triggers are very personal. And so it's part of the assessment, the complexity is to try to understand what might bring someone to mobilize to violence. And that reason, that trigger, can be very different from people. It can depends on their very personal experience and different grievances. So it's very hard to say that type of event might trigger that kind of violent extremism reaction. It depends for everybody.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clerk, if we could please pull up COM 50935, and if you can go to the 8th page in the file. There's a 3 at the bottom, though. That's how it's numbered. While that's being pulled up, we've heard a bit about how the definition for threats to the security of Canada doesn't include protest. Am I right in thinking that the basic idea here is that if there's a protest where one of the 4 factors aren't present, you don't investigate, and if there's a protest where the 4 factors are present, you would investigate, right?
I think the CSIS Act is pretty clear. If we look at the document, the paragraph under D, under 2D, does not include lawful advocacy, protest, or dissent unless carried on in conjunction with any of the activities cited above.
Right, so the fact that it's a protest isn't a barrier to an investigation if one of these things is present.
I would say, generally speaking, the service stays away from investigating protests. We recognize it's a democratic right in Canada, so we don't investigate protests. What this means is, if an example perhaps I can give, if we had information that a terrorist group was going to pretend to use an event in order to conduct a terrorist activity, well, of course, that would be of interest to CSIS. But we are very, very conscious and aware of balancing the rights of individuals in a democracy like Canada with our own mandate and our more intrusive techniques.
Okay, Mr. Vigneault, so let's look at, we can look at A first. Based on the services assessment, there was no espionage or sabotage associated with the protest, correct?
That's correct.
So the 2A definition wasn't met?
No.
Okay. And there was no foreign interference?
We have, I think it's in our testimony that we have said that we investigated foreign interference in relation to the event, including foreign funding, and we do not see these activities amounting to a threat to the security of Canada.
So 2B wasn't met?
Yeah.
Thank you. And there wasn't any serious violence associated with the protests?
I would not say that.
Or a credible threat of serious violence?
That's not what we're looking at. We're looking at, how these events or individuals, might engage in activities that meet our threshold. This is where I was answering questions earlier about, distinction between what law enforcement would be doing in terms of serious violence versus what we would do as a CSIS under the confine of the CSIS Act.
Okay, I'll be more specific then. There were no activities within or relating to Canada directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective within Canada, correct?
Yes, and we've testified to that earlier. I think.
So 2C wasn't
2C was not met.
Okay, and just quickly, there was no credible threat to overthrowing our established system of government.
I can say that we have not investigated under 2D.
Okay, thank you. So not only was there no Section 2 threat present, but there wasn't even reasonable grounds to suspect a Section 2 threat was present.
Well, we are on the record to say that we already had individuals who had met the 2C threshold. That were subject of investigation that were involved, and that so we had legitimate grounds to be looking at what was happening. As we've said, based on our expertise, we have seen, unfortunately, events like that where individuals were radicalized and mobilized to violence extremely quickly. So that's why we continue to expend those resources throughout those events to make sure that we, again, did not miss something.
If I could just have an indulgence to sort of hit the last point I've been working up to, I'll try to be very quick.
Yeah, although you could have skipped A, B, C, D, it's been testified to many times that it wasn't met, but go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. So, sorry, that threat that you're speaking about is with respect to individuals, but the protest itself did not pose a Section 2 threat to the security of Canada.
What we've testified to is that we did not made a determination that the event itself, and I think it's part of our testimony, yes.
Okay, and yet you still advised the Prime Minister to invoke the Emergencies Act?
Yes, I did.
And you did that not because you thought that there was the protest posed a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, but because you were reassured that threat to the security of Canada had a different meaning in the context of the Emergencies Act.
I think my testimony was in part that, but it was also based on all of the other information that I became aware of during all of the interdepartmental meetings and cabinet meetings I participated in. So I was provided, that opinion was provided, if you want, as a national security advisor, as opposed to the director of CSIS specifically.
Okay, when you say that information that you had received, you're referring to your earlier comment that you were reassured that definition had a broader meaning under the Emergencies Act?
I was referring to that, but also more specifically to other events in Canada, events, in Ottawa that, convinced me to say that, the powers under the Act would be necessary.
Okay, so just my final question.
Yeah, we better get at
The very last question. This determination then that the Emergencies Act standard is the definition is broader under the Emergencies Act than with respect to under the CSIS Act. That was not the product of you reading the Emergencies Act and developing your own assessment. That was advice that you had received.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the indulgence, Mr. Commissioner.